My name's Kavin, and I'm a current junior at Walter Payton in Chicago. Today's lecture is on critiques from the outside. So first, let's go through the basics of what a critique actually is. So it's similar to a disad. It has a link and an impact, which are reasons why the plan's ideological structure and or the plan's representations are bad. It's different from a disad because the impact is usually something like racism or settler violence instead of something like the politics disad, where the impact would be more traditionally extinction. The links are non-unique, meaning they're already happening now, which is why framework, which we'll talk about later, along with the alternative matter. So the alternative provides uniqueness to the links. It usually solves the structure the critique is about, and it's something fiated or affirmed in a round that resolves the links. So let's go through some examples. The first one is the settler colonialism K. The link is Arctic policy is colonialist, causing a cycle of settler violence on indigenous peoples in the Arctic, whether from resource extraction or government intervention in their land. The alternative is to decolonize the Arctic, the US fully leaves. This resolves the links because it destroys US Arctic policy, which means that the US cannot be colonial anymore. But the link is non-unique, which is why the alt is needed. Arctic policy and colonialism all exist now. The next example is the capitalism K. The link is Arctic policy is used as a pretext for resource extraction, sustaining global systems of capitalism. The impact is capitalism causes extinction. There's also some scenarios where it's capitalism causes racial or settler violence, which you can still answer in a similar way. The alt is communist revolution, which resolves the links because it gets rid of all capitalist development in the Arctic. But the link is not unique because capitalist institutions, markets, and other things all exist now that all uphold capitalist structures, so the alt is needed to provide uniqueness. Now imagine the neg kicks the alternative. This would be bad for them because the links would all be not unique. The plan is not a unique increase in capitalism, which means that voting negative does not solve capitalism. So the typical AF responses follow a format I like to call FL-PAT. So the F stands for framework. The L stands for no link. The plan does not perpetuate whatever structure. For example, if it's capitalism, you say the plan is not capitalist because the plan does not deploy capitalist systems or do resource extraction. Neg links are usually pretty general and almost never about the plan itself. The P stands for permutations. The A stands for alt fails. It cannot resolve the entirety of the structure. For example, the CapK, a communist revolution, cannot solve all of capitalism because militaries and PMCs and other groups would crack down. Obviously, if the US tried to shift to communism, Trump would probably not be very happy, which means the alt would fail. The T stands for theory. It's something the alternative fiats, and by fiat I mean a mandate of the alternative, and that's something that should not be allowed. For example, international fiat is bad. Private actor fiat bad. Private actor just means actors that are not the USFG, and other things. If their alternative is legitimate, then that would justify things like all countries of the world stop fighting and become peaceful is also a legitimate negative position, which makes being affirmative impossible. So now the permutations. Do both is the best. If the alt can overcome the status quo, which means what is happening right now, then inclusion of the plan is so small that it would not prevent the alt from solving. It prevents alts that fiat out of literally everything from existing. For example, if the CapK, if the alt of communist revolution fiats that every single person everywhere all over the globe becomes communist, then obviously the plan's small inclusion of a capitalist policy is not enough to make the alt fail. Because of the perm, teams will often kick the alternative and go for framework. So let's talk about framework. Why use framework? Let's give a hypothetical. Advantage 1 is China. Deterring China in the Arctic is key to prevent war. The 1 in C and the 2 in R read a racial IRK. Saying China is a threat in the Arctic is racist and encourages people to be racist to Chinese people because they could conflate them with the Chinese government. After the round, how can the judge decide if racism outweighs extinction or the K outweighs the F? That's where framework comes in. It's basically judge instruction for how they should compare the links and the impacts that operate at different scales. For example, racism and extinction. The basics are each team will have an interpretation and reasons to prefer that interpretation, almost like a topicality debate, except it's not based on definitions of the topic. It's based on how debate as a game should function. Let's use the China IR example again. The neg will say debate should be about the AF's discourse, even if the AF is a good idea, the way they've talked about China is racist and should outweigh any potential benefits. That means the AF does not get to weigh the 1AC, which basically means the AF cannot say that the AF is a good idea until they prove that they are not racist. That also brackets out saying things like extinction outweighs racism, because it means that the AF, we cannot evaluate whether the AF is a good idea without first evaluating if they're racist. The AF want to say no, that's an unreasonable burden, and that debate should only be about the consequences of the plan. Just because some of the 1AC's rhetoric was maybe problematic does not mean we should ignore a great idea. That lets the AF then say extinction outweighs because the judge is a policymaker that should prioritize saving lives over scrutinizing rhetoric. So the best affirmative argument is that the neg's interpretation is a slippery slope. What I mean by that is their interp would result in infinite minor cherry-picked critiques of the 1AC. What if the 13th card of the 1AC cites one person who is a Russian sympathizer, or the neg reads 8 minutes of the government is historically racist and the AF should lose because they used the government? Should the AF lose because of those? Where does the judge draw the line? It's impossible because the negative interpretation allows links to any part of discourse, which means that the AF's framework interpretation is the best stasis point for debate because it is only based on whether the plan is a good or bad idea. So let's talk specifics. This is one of the best framework interpretations. The ballot is referendum on the plan's desirability, links must have uniqueness and be weighed against a fiat implementation, and then some fairness and clash offense. So let's break it down. Referendum on plan's desirability. This just means the judge should vote AF if the plan is a good idea. Discourse and representations matter much less than the consequences because a judge should be determining whether or not the plan stops material harm, not whether the rhetoric it used was good or bad. Links must have uniqueness. This is what we discussed earlier. Links must be to the plan, which excludes links like the state is racist, the plan uses the state. Let's take the settler colonialism example we used earlier. Capitalist development and settler colonialist development in the Arctic already exist now. The plan is not a unique increase, which means the link does not have uniqueness. The final part is links must be weighed against the plan. Solving extinction is the most important, even if they win the plan is uniquely racist. So even if they win that their links about colonialism are right, they need to win that outweighs preventing extinction. The final one is the only predictable point of stasis. The resolution says the USFG should, so debate should only be about policymaking because that's what the resolution says. We'll talk more about fairness and clash. So first is fairness. Their interpretation is bad because it is unfair for the AF. The AF needs to prepare for thousands of Ks, defend every word, even those not highlighted in the 1AC, and other things like the examples we discussed earlier. Under the negative interp, if they win any small risk of a link, then the AF would lose. A 0.0001% chance that the AF increases colonialism is enough to vote neg under the negative's interpretation because the AF cannot weigh the plan or evaluate whether the plan is a good idea until they prove that they are 100% not racist and 100% do not use bad rhetoric. So this brings us to the impact part of fairness. Why does it matter? First, it's the intrinsic good. Debate is a game which definitionally relies on fairness because all games require some adherence to shared rules. For example, the negative is also going to request that the judge evaluate the flow technically. They vote on dropped arguments, adhere to speech times, etc., which all proves that fairness is the thing that underpins debate, and saying that fairness is irrelevant makes no sense in that context. Second is that it's a material impact. Unfairness makes debate a nightmare. AF teams need to prep for thousands of Ks, and research would be disvalued. Because if the neg teams could read cherry-picked interpretations and cherry-picked links to single phrases in the 1AC that are not even read by the affirmative, that means the AF needs to prepare defenses of every single word in their 1AC, which is an unreasonable burden. So the second impact is clash. Clash basically just refers to engagement between the AF and the neg. The AF, if they're going for clash, wants to say it's the only impact specific to debate. Researching proposals and advocating them against well-trained opponents makes us more educated and better at what we want to advance in the real world. That means that the negative cannot access the benefits of their model because no one would know what to prepare for, so no one engages with their critique because it was not predictable. Remember, the resolution says the United States federal government should do something. The negative's interpretation eliminates that stasis point because it is purely about the discourse presented rather than discussing if something is a better policy solution. That also means we cannot become advocates for strategies to combat material things like racism because we never learn about them, which means that engagement is the best thing for debate. The final part of this is answering the negative offense. The most common thing that negative teams will say is that your interpretation is some form of exclusion. The formula for answering all of the 2NC and the 1NR disads on framework is as follows. Neg teams will say you're exclusionary, and you want to say first is no link. We do not prescribe a style of debate. What I like to say is it's a floor, not a ceiling. It's simply a base floor that every team must meet. Second, they link. Their interpretation still causes the thing that their offense critiques. For example, their interp of only discourse excludes minority debaters who want to read a plan and talk about topical action, because they can't if we're always bogged down in discussions of whether rhetoric is good or not. Third is no impact. Debate does not change how we think. You might have heard this as no subjectivity shift. All causes like school, family, friends, etc. are more impactful in our cognitive development, which means that the only thing we take away from debate is engagement between two sides and also the fairness in the game. And the final thing is no ballot solvency. It cannot stop us from reading these impacts in the future, and it won't solve violence in the real world, because the only thing the ballot can ever do is say whether or not someone has won the debate or lost the debate. So let's use an example. The exclusion dissad. The premise is that saying debate is only about planned consequence is the same thing as saying whatever critique should not matter, or whatever critique should be excluded from debate. The neg will say that's violent because it tells minorities that their critique is irrelevant. The best AF answers are very similar to the formula that I just showed above. First, no link. Framework does not say the K is not valuable, just that they need to use it to prove the plan is bad. They should have to win the plan is colonialist, not the state the plan uses is colonialist. If the plan is a unique increase in colonialism, and the neg wins that racism outweighs extinction for a different reason, then the negative can win, but they can't win by bracketing out and mooting the entire plan. Second, they link. They exclude minorities that want to read a plan and debate about the government. Third is no internal link. Voting AF does not exclude opponents or minorities. It just says they should not be rewarded with the ballot. For example, think of it like a sport. If someone is caught offside in soccer or a foul is called to them in basketball, they aren't called cheaters or excluded, they just aren't rewarded with a goal or a basket. Thank you for listening to this lecture today, and have a great rest of your day.